Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on my first video here at Marksman Radio. I know I launched this channel about a month ago, but it has taken a long time to get my lights in and sort of set up my at-home studio. So I've done relatively at least enough to get things going here. So I wanted to go ahead and kick off this channel with this first video. Now keep in mind, this is my personal channel. Here I'm going to be talking about more things that I am personally interested, political topics, business-related topics and things like that. The content over on Marksman TV is going to be more heavily focused on firearms themselves, reviews, shooting, the Used Gun Weekly Review. That stuff's still going to continue, but all of this is going to be mainly talking in this sort of format. So for the first video, I wanted to talk about a couple recent events that have happened just north of us in Canada. Obviously, there was a horrific shooting event that took place there a couple weeks ago, which has been followed up with some pretty severe legislation from Trudeau in the form of an assault weapon ban, which sort of banned by name about 1,500 firearms. Now, moving through this first, I think that what's going on sort of illustrates an interesting point. Now, in my personal life, like many of you, I like to debate, sort of talk about let me back up. I get myself involved in firearms debates pretty frequently with people. Now, most of the people I interact with, through my store and through my family are pro-gun, so I don't get the biggest opportunity. But occasionally online, and I try not to argue with people online. But of course, sometimes friends of friends, some family members do have different opinions when it comes to firearm ownership. And I do, when I end up in those conversations, a lot of arguments tend to present themselves pretty frequently. And one of the biggest ones is, of course, for us on the pro-gun side, when it comes to legislation, one of the big things that we as pro-gun advocates are afraid of is what a lot of people would call the slippery slope argument. Slippery slope argument is basically based on the premise of if we enact such bill or legislation A, it will lead to such legislation B, which could lead to such legislation C. A prime example of this would be universal background checks. Okay, so we say, obviously, if we are opposed to universal background checks, biggest question people would ask is why? And you say, okay, well, if we have universal background checks, there is no way to enforce that unless we have a registry. The registry is now B. That's not legislation we were talking about, but by imposing universal background checks, we are afraid that registration of firearms will be next. Okay, if we talk about registration of firearms coming next, what are we afraid of having happen? Well, confiscation. So it'll be easy for the government to obviously confiscate firearms if they know where they are. So again, presently we're talking universal background checks will lead to registration, will lead to confiscation. That's what's technically called a slippery slope fallacy. It is, in terms of logic, it is a fallacy. I'm not a logician, but when I make that, and I make that argument myself plenty of times, where again, if we want any type of legislation, if we want to ban AR-15s, well, we know that that's not going to stop mass shootings. They'll continue to happen with handguns. Once AR-15s are banned, then it'll be handguns. Okay, once the handguns are banned, it'll continue with bolt action rifles and shotguns, and then we'll ban those. Again, that's a slippery slope argument. Now, just because it is technically a logical fallacy, is that where the argument stops? They say, okay, well, this is a logical fallacy. The point is moot and void, and it's when we're talking about legislation, we can't concern ourselves with the slippery slope argument because, again, logically it doesn't make any sense. Well, then I propose to you exactly the situation that's happening in Canada. So, backing up a couple weeks ago, we had a shooting. It was a mix of a shooting and an arson, a string of arson. This individual, essentially, not going to name who it is, was a prominent figure in Nova Scotia, had purchased I think it was a retired police cruiser, or he had somehow done up his police cruiser, and there's really not a whole lot of information out here on what happened. Had procured a police uniform. He was not with the police force. Had begun pulling people over in their vehicles and shooting them on the spot. Of course, it all started with a domestic violence sort of thing. It was his estranged girlfriend was living with somebody. He started there, then went on this string of terror over the course of about 12 hours. Now, somewhere in the about 21, 22 people were killed. About half of those were killed with a firearm at this point. Again, we don't know what that was. And the other half was killed through a string of arsons, so he would set fires, and people perished that way as well. Of course, this is all tremendously horrible, and of course nothing we would want in any of our communities. And it really weighs heavily on the heart for anybody who has to even be remotely attached to what happened there in Nova Scotia. Now, as a result, Trudeau 2 days ago enacted, and he named this as the basis for his decision. And this was out legislative vote. This was just his pure passing of these laws. Was to eliminate 1,500 firearms by name. These would include the AR-15, which I had the impression was already banned in Canada. This was also the Mini 14. AKs, I think, were also previously banned in Canada, and of course there already existed magazine capacity limits and licensing. Okay, despite all of that happening, this event took place, and what we also know about this event is those firearms were procured, I believe, here in the United States and illegally imported into Canada, and also this person did not have a license, so he was not actually observing any of the laws as they stood. But if we back up to say, I believe, like I said, I believe those licensing requirements happened in the 90s. If we back up to the 1990s and we're Canadian citizens, and we're looking at this legislation coming forward about getting licensing and magazine capacity limits and stuff like that, and we as hypothetical Canadians in the 90s had said, we don't want licensing, we don't want registration, because it's not going to stop there. You're going to ban eventually these guns anyway. If we do this, if we register them, you're going to know where they are, and it's going to lead to being banned. Well, of course, the counter argument in the 90s to the hypothetical Canadians making that point would be that's a slippery slope argument. You can't make that argument because, you're saying A will lead to B, will lead to C. Well, here, 2 days ago, C just happened. That was something that pro-gun people, I'm sure at the time and even since then, were concerned about, and it ended up happening. So let's equate that to us as Americans here in the United States. When we talk about doing licensing, okay, which is what actively people are pushing for right now, universal background checks, actively what people are pushing for now, magazine capacity restrictions, actively what people are pushing for now. These are the laws that all existed in Canada 3 days ago. They exist today, but they existed when the shooting happened. I am posing the argument. I am afraid that you will pass these laws. Law-abiding citizens will observe them because that's what we do. Criminals will not, and the shootings will continue to happen. And once you have the magazine restrictions, the universal background checks, the registration, banning of AR-15s, whatever it is, it will not stop there. The things will continue to happen because people are, there are inherently bad people. They will find a way to make them happen, and they will. And then we will have the debate about what the next set of things is to ban. And now that this has happened in Canada, I can't, the proof is there. It's happened. We are afraid of what happened in Canada 2 days ago happening here in the United States. And this will be another interesting thing to consider, and I hope it does not happen, but what if another shooting takes place with firearms that were on Canadians' ban list? Are they going to then say, well, you're right, it didn't solve anything, these guns were obtained anyway, we're going to go ahead and reverse our 2020 decision to ban these 1,500 firearms, and we're going to try something else? No, that's not what's going to happen. Of course, once those laws are on the books, they're there to say. Politically, it doesn't look good, even for a conservative, and I'm going to equate this to America. Even for conservatives, a lot of conservatives will not touch overturning gun policy because to a lot of their constituents, it doesn't look good, and it's usually easy cannon fodder for Democrats to sort of fire at them in their districts when it comes time for re-election. Or there's no sort of provisional clause that says, hey, we are going to ban ARs. If an AR is used in a shooting, we will return them back to legal status. Unless you have provisions like that go along with the law, it'll never be repealed or overturned. What I would like to see with some of this legislation, whether we're talking here domestically like universal background checks, I would like to see some sort of clause, or at least some sort of earnest, sort of in good faith sort of gestures from people who are proposing these laws that say, listen, we think universal background checks will curb gun violence. We want to implement this for a period of 5 years. We're going to put these 10 people on this board, 5 of which will be Democrat, 5 of which will be conservative. Each party can choose their 5. During the course of this, we will assess to see if it has had an impact on crime. And if it has been proven that there has been no impact, we will remove the law. Okay, that's sort of what happened with the assault weapons ban, except it just had a 10-year sunset clause in it. So no matter what happened after the period of 10 years, it was, basically would expire. Now, of course, studies were done on the assault weapons ban. Pro-gun people will claim that, of course, it had no effect on violent crime. Anti-gun people will claim that it did have an effect on violent crime. So, of course, data, like anything else, can be tilted in one way to paint one picture or another. That's why it would be good to actually have a communal group of people designed and set forth with a set of parameters by which they will have to use the data, and that will be the empirical data set by which both parties or both people can look at. If it truly does, and it can be proven to have an effect on violent crime and lives are saved, then I'm willing to have that conversation. This is how it helped. Then can we do some other things alongside that, that don't involve banning guns? Like, why did it help? Why was the fact that a universal background check did help in the reduction of crime? Was it because criminals who, were seeing so much recidivism? Was it the people who were otherwise barred because they had to go through a background check and they couldn't do things in private sales? Was it a recidivism type issue? And can we address that instead of just saying abridging the rights of people? So if we can have a earnest sort of good approach to all ways that we can try and eliminate crime, it seems to always be guns. For some reason, it's always the only thing we ever talk about is guns. And primarily, I think that's because we have such a need to, again, have that knee-jerk reaction. We have to do something immediately that has an effect now. And everything else that we could possibly do, obviously, to people is going to come with a very long-term sort of process for enacting where people think, okay, if we ban guns today, it'll have an immediate effect. But the politics of things like this are inherently incredibly frustrating. It would be nice to take an approach, if Trudeau had actually sat down and thought about what were the things that transpired, what were the facts of the case that happened there in Nova Scotia a couple weeks ago. What was the person's mental state? How is this person able to get across the border into Canada? I mean, what sort of importation how is the importation of firearms so easy for this person to achieve? Did somebody else do it on his behalf? Why was that person able to do that? What were the firearms used? Again, we don't really know. Did that really have an impact on the number of lives that were lost? Were the magazines restricted or not? Of course, again, Canada has restricted mags. Given to the instances that this perpetrator, opened fire on these people, were magazine reloads necessary? I think none of that information really matters. I think what matters is the fact that Trudeau wants to be seen to be doing something by the constituents in his party. Hate to see people's gun rights used like a ping pong ball in a game of table tennis. It seems to be what we have to deal with a lot as gun owners. We are sort of painted as this monolithic group of people who tend to only care about our firearms more than the lives of people. And, alternately, I hate that argument as well, and I'll talk more about that in another day, how we inherently don't care about the lives of people. It's a false attribution of motive, for us, for our desire to own firearms. But again, that'll be a topic for another video. I just wish that sometimes we could get a genuine reaction to these events as they happen and actually sit down and try to come together to come up with things that may work other than the constant and repetitive hacking away at people's rights to own firearms. And again, the people who follow these laws, us as Americans, and you guys as Canadians, if you're watching, none of us have done anything wrong. We follow the laws. In fact, legally, we are the most upstanding citizens in our countries. We have no criminal records. We don't stalk people. We're not addicted to drugs. No misdemeanors in domestic violence disputes. We're not illegal aliens. We haven't been discharged from the armed forces dishonorably. We have not been adjudicated mentally defective. We have not been convicted of any felonies. We are not addicted to narcotics. We are model citizens. We just want to engage in our right to own firearms. without those rights being taken away every time somebody else breaks the law and uses one of the firearms that we may legally own to create a heinous act. And of course, I'm just tired of the fact that this always has to be, my rights have to be on the chopping block. And that seems to be the only reasonable solution for anybody to look at these days. So it's very unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave you there with those thoughts on this first video. Thank you for coming in and hanging out with me here. If you like this video format, please let me know. Again, it's mainly going to just be rambling thoughts. This channel is just for me to talk about the things I want to talk about. So if you want to stop by and listen, subscribe, I really appreciate it. Again, for more firearm-related centric stuff, just check me out over on Marksman TV. But anyway, guys, I will leave you there. I'm Chris with Marksman Radio. I will catch you guys next time.